They say silence can be louder than a scream. In 1848, in the sweltering heat of southern Louisiana, there lived a woman who proved that truth in the most chilling way imaginable. Her name was Marguerite Beaumont, and for 3 years, she didn't speak a single word. Not to her neighbors, not to the shopkeepers in town, not even to the priest who came to her door every Sunday, begging her to confess whatever demons plagued her soul. But while Marguerite remained silent, the people around her began to disappear, one by one, and she was there for every single burial. The story begins on a humid August morning, when the first death occurred. Jean-Baptiste Beaumont, Marguerite's husband of 12 years, collapsed in their cotton fields. He had been working since dawn, as he did every day, supervising the laborers who tended the vast plantation that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. The sun was merciless that day, beating down on the red Louisiana soil with an intensity that made even the strongest men seek shade. But Jean-Baptiste was determined to finish inspecting the cotton bolls before noon. He never made it. At 11:30, he dropped to his knees, clutching his chest, his face turning the color of ash. The workers carried him back to the main house, where Marguerite waited on the wraparound porch, her expression unreadable behind the black lace of her mourning veil. By the time Dr. Armand Leblanc arrived from town, Jean-Baptiste was already gone. The doctor examined the body with practiced efficiency, noting the bluish tint to the lips, the rigid posture, the peculiar smell that lingered in the room. Heart failure, he declared, not uncommon for men who worked themselves to exhaustion in the oppressive southern heat. Marguerite stood in the corner of the bedroom, her hands folded neatly at her waist, watching the doctor work. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply nodded when the doctor offered his condolences and turned away when he suggested she might want to say a final goodbye to her husband. The funeral took place 3 days later at the small Catholic cemetery on the edge of town. The entire community attended, as was customary when a prominent landowner passed away. The Beaumont plantation was one of the largest in the parish, and Jean-Baptiste had been well respected, if not particularly well liked. He had a reputation for being stern and demanding, both with his workers and his wife. More than one neighbor had witnessed him speaking harshly to Marguerite in public, his voice sharp with disapproval. But that was considered normal. A man had the right to discipline his household as he saw fit. Marguerite stood beside the freshly dug grave, dressed entirely in black silk that seemed to absorb the afternoon sunlight. Her face was covered by a thick veil, making it impossible to read her expression. She didn't shed a tear during the service. She didn't flinch when the coffin was lowered into the ground. She didn't even bow her head during the priest's final prayer. She simply stood there, as still as a statue carved from marble, while the humid air pressed down on everyone like a heavy blanket. When the service ended and the other mourners began to disperse, offering their sympathies in hushed voices, Marguerite remained at the graveside. She stayed there for nearly an hour, staring down at the mound of fresh earth before finally turning and walking back to her carriage. That was when people first started to whisper. There was something unnatural about a woman who didn't weep for her dead husband, something disturbing about her complete silence. In the weeks that followed, those whispers grew louder. Marguerite stopped attending church services. She stopped receiving visitors. She stopped going into town for supplies. Instead, she remained on the plantation, moving through the grand house like a ghost, attended only by her elderly housekeeper, Celeste, and the handful of workers who maintained the property. And then, exactly 6 weeks after Jean-Baptiste's death, the second person died. This time, it was Claude Beaumont, Jean-Baptiste's younger brother, who had moved into the plantation house to help Marguerite manage the estate. He was found dead in his bed one October morning, his face frozen in an expression of surprise, his body already cold. Dr. Leblanc was summoned once again, his black medical bag in hand as he climbed the steps to the Beaumont plantation. The house seemed darker somehow, more oppressive than it had been just weeks earlier. The shutters were drawn tight against the autumn sunlight, and an unusual stillness hung over the property. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. The doctor found Claude's body exactly where the housekeeper had described, lying peacefully in the guest bedroom on the second floor. At first glance, it appeared he had simply died in his sleep. But as Dr. Leblanc conducted his examination, he noticed disturbing similarities to Jean-Baptiste's death. The same bluish discoloration of the lips, the same rigid posture, the same faint, almost imperceptible odor that he couldn't quite identify. Marguerite stood in the doorway throughout the examination, her presence so quiet that the doctor nearly forgot she was there. When he finally turned to speak with her, he found her watching him with dark, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. He opened his mouth to ask questions about Claude's final hours, about what he had eaten, about whether he had complained of any illness. But before he could speak, Marguerite raised one pale hand and pressed her finger to her lips, a gesture for silence. Then she turned and glided away down the hallway, her black skirts whispering against the wooden floors. The doctor was left standing in the bedroom, his medical bag clutched in his sweating hands, a chill running down his spine despite the warm October air. He had practiced medicine for 23 years. He had seen death in all its forms, from violent accidents to wasting illnesses. But he had never encountered anything quite like this. Two healthy men, both in the prime of their lives, both dying suddenly with identical symptoms, and both deaths occurring in the same house, under the watch of the same silent woman. He knew what people in town would say. He knew the accusations that would follow. But without evidence, without proof of foul play, he could do nothing except sign another death certificate and list the cause as heart failure. Claude's funeral was smaller than Jean-Baptiste's had been. Fewer people made the journey out to the plantation, and those who did arrive seemed nervous, uncomfortable. They stood in tight clusters, speaking in low voices, casting furtive glances toward Marguerite as she stood beside the second fresh grave in the family cemetery. Once again, she was completely covered in black. Once again, she showed no emotion. Once again, she remained at the graveside long after everyone else had left, standing perfectly still in the fading afternoon light. The priest, Father Antoine Devereux, lingered nearby, hoping she might finally speak, might offer some explanation or seek some comfort, but she never acknowledged his presence. She simply stared down at the grave until the sun began to set, then walked back to the house without a word. That night, the rumors began in earnest. In the taverns and parlors of town, people spoke in hushed, urgent voices about the silent woman of Beaumont Plantation. Some claimed she had poisoned both men, driven mad by years of her husband's cruel treatment. Others insisted she was a witch who had sold her soul to dark forces in exchange for her freedom. A few even suggested she was possessed by some malevolent spirit that compelled her to kill. But there were also those who defended her, pointing out that no evidence of poisoning had been found, that both deaths had been ruled natural by a respected physician. These defenders were quickly shouted down by those who believed that silence itself was proof of guilt. What innocent woman would refuse to speak in her own defense? As autumn deepened into winter, Marguerite retreated further into isolation. The plantation workers reported seeing her walking the grounds at odd hours, always alone, always silent. She would stand in the cotton fields where her husband had died, or sit in the family cemetery between the two graves, her black figure stark against the winter-brown grass. The housekeeper, Celeste, became the only link between Marguerite and the outside world, making weekly trips to town for supplies and returning with goods but offering no information about her mistress's state of mind. When pressed for details, Celeste would only shake her head and say that Madame Beaumont was grieving in her own way, that she needed time and privacy to heal. Winter in Louisiana was never truly cold, but that year seemed different. A persistent dampness hung in the air, seeping into bones and making everything feel colder than the temperature suggested. The bayous surrounding the Beaumont plantation turned dark and still, their waters reflecting the gray sky like pools of liquid lead. Spanish moss hung heavy from the cypress trees, swaying in the occasional breeze like the hair of drowned women. And in the middle of this gloomy landscape stood the plantation house, its white columns taking on a yellowish tint in the weak winter sunlight, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. In January, the third death occurred. This time, it was Henri Deschamps, a wealthy cotton broker from New Orleans who had come to discuss business matters with Marguerite. He had been one of Jean-Baptiste's oldest business associates, and he had taken it upon himself to ensure that the widow wasn't being cheated by opportunistic buyers. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, his fine carriage rattling up the long drive lined with bare oak trees. Celeste showed him into the parlor, where Marguerite received him with a silent nod. According to Celeste's later testimony, they sat together for nearly 2 hours, Deschamps doing all the talking while Marguerite listened, occasionally pointing to documents or writing brief notes on paper. He seemed perfectly healthy when he left the parlor to take his midday meal. The meal was served in the formal dining room, a cold repast of sliced ham, pickled vegetables, cornbread, and sweet tea. Celeste prepared everything herself, as she always did, using ingredients that came from the plantation's own stores. Deschamps ate with good appetite, complimenting the food and chatting pleasantly with Celeste about his journey from New Orleans. Marguerite sat at the opposite end of the long table, eating nothing, drinking only water, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the windows. When the meal concluded, Deschamps thanked his hostess with a slight bow and retired to the guest room to rest before his return journey. He never woke up. Celeste found him 3 hours later when she went to inform him that his carriage was ready. He was lying on top of the bed covers, fully dressed, his eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But when she tried to wake him, his skin was already cold. She let out a scream that echoed through the entire house, a sound of pure terror that sent chills through everyone who heard it. Marguerite appeared in the doorway moments later, moving with that same eerie silence that characterized all her actions. She looked at the dead man, then at her distraught housekeeper, then turned and walked away. Celeste would later swear that she saw something in Marguerite's eyes at that moment. Not sadness or shock, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. This time, Dr. Leblanc refused to come. When a messenger arrived at his office in town with news of another death at the Beaumont plantation, he sent word back that he was too ill to make the journey. In truth, he wasn't ill at all. He was terrified. 3 deaths, all with identical symptoms, all occurring in the same house. The odds of such a coincidence were astronomically small, but what frightened him even more was the memory of Marguerite's eyes watching him during Claude's examination. Those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets he didn't want to discover. Instead, he recommended that the authorities send for Dr. Marcus Thornton, a younger physician who had recently arrived from Virginia and had experience with forensic medicine. Dr. Thornton arrived the following day, accompanied by Sheriff Jacques Rousseau and 2 deputies. The sheriff was a large man with a thick mustache and a reputation for fairness, but even he seemed unsettled as they approached the plantation house. The place had developed an ominous reputation in recent months, and more than one person in town had suggested it was cursed. Marguerite met them at the door, dressed as always in unrelieved black, her face hidden behind her veil. She stepped aside wordlessly to allow them entry, then led them upstairs to where Henri Deschamps still lay on the guest-room bed, his body now stiff with rigor mortis. Dr. Thornton's examination was thorough and methodical. He spent over an hour studying the body, taking notes, collecting samples of various fluids and tissues. Unlike Dr. Leblanc, he showed no fear or hesitation. He asked Celeste detailed questions about the deceased man's activities, about what he had eaten and drunk, about any complaints of illness. He inspected the dining room and kitchen, examining the remaining food from the midday meal. He even requested samples of the well water and the tea leaves. Through it all, Marguerite stood nearby, silent and still, her presence like a dark shadow that followed them through every room. When Dr. Thornton finally completed his investigation, he called Sheriff Rousseau aside for a private consultation in the library. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour, their voices too low for anyone else to hear. When they emerged, the sheriff's face was grim. He approached Marguerite, who waited in the hallway with her hands clasped before her, and informed her that Henri Deschamps' body would need to be transported to New Orleans for further examination. He didn't accuse her of anything directly, but his meaning was clear. There were too many suspicious deaths, and the authorities could no longer ignore the pattern. Marguerite's response was typical. She simply nodded and stepped aside to allow the deputies to remove the body. News of the 3rd death spread through the parish like wildfire. By evening, everyone in town knew that another man had died at the Beaumont plantation, and this time The authorities were involved. The taverns and shops buzzed with speculation and fear. Some people called for Marguerite's immediate arrest. Others organized prayer circles, convinced that demonic forces were at work. A few brave souls suggested that perhaps the plantation itself was contaminated somehow, that there might be a natural explanation for the deaths. But most people had already made up their minds. The silent woman was a murderer, and her refusal to speak was proof of her guilt. The following weeks were agonizing for everyone involved. Dr. Thornton conducted extensive tests on the tissue samples he had collected, consulting with colleagues in New Orleans and even sending specimens to experts in Boston. Sheriff Rousseau interviewed everyone who had any connection to the Beaumont plantation, from neighboring farmers to the workers who tended the fields. He questioned Celeste repeatedly, pushing her for any detail that might suggest foul play. But the elderly housekeeper could offer nothing suspicious. She swore that Madame Beaumont had never touched the food she prepared, had never gone near the well water alone, had never done anything that might indicate murderous intent. The meals were always prepared in her presence, using ingredients that came from their own stores or from trusted suppliers in town. Meanwhile, Marguerite continued her daily routine as if nothing had changed. She rose at dawn and walked the plantation grounds, her black figure visible against the winter landscape. She sat for hours in the parlor, reading or doing needlework, always alone. She took her meals in the dining room, though she ate sparingly, pushing food around her plate while Celeste watched with worried eyes. And every afternoon, without fail, she visited the family cemetery, standing between the graves of her husband and his brother, her head bowed as if in prayer. The workers began to avoid her, crossing themselves when she passed and muttering prayers of protection. Even Celeste, who had known her for years, began to feel uneasy in her presence. In late February, Dr. Thornton returned to the parish with his findings. He met with Sheriff Rousseau in private, presenting his analysis and conclusions. The results were frustrating and inconclusive. While he had detected traces of unusual substances in the tissue samples, he could not definitively prove that any poison had been administered. The compounds he found could have been present naturally in the food or water, or they could have been the result of decomposition. Without more sophisticated equipment, and without catching someone in the act of poisoning, he simply couldn't build a case that would stand up in court. The doctor's professional opinion was that while the deaths were certainly suspicious, there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone with murder. Sheriff Rousseau was deeply dissatisfied with this outcome, but he had no choice but to accept it. He couldn't arrest Marguerite based solely on suspicion and circumstantial evidence. Louisiana law required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and he simply didn't have it. He made one final attempt to break through her silence, arriving at the plantation on a cold March morning and requesting a private audience. Marguerite received him in the parlor, sitting across from him with her hands folded in her lap, her veil finally lifted to reveal a pale, beautiful face, with sharp cheekbones and those penetrating dark eyes. The sheriff pleaded with her to speak, to defend herself, to offer any explanation that might clear her name. He told her that her silence was destroying her reputation, that the entire parish believed she was a murderer, that her continued refusal to speak would haunt her for the rest of her life. Marguerite listened to his entire speech without moving, without changing expression. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by his own desperation, she reached across the table and placed one cold hand over his. Then she opened her mouth as if to speak, and for a moment the sheriff's heart leaped with hope. But no sound came out. She simply closed her mouth again, withdrew her hand and stood up to indicate the meeting was over. The sheriff left the plantation that day convinced of two things. First, that Marguerite Beaumont knew exactly what had killed those three men, and second, that she would never, ever tell. Spring arrived in Louisiana with an explosion of color and life that seemed almost obscene given the darkness hanging over the Beaumont plantation. The magnolias bloomed white and fragrant, the azaleas burst into shades of pink and purple, and the cotton fields turned green with new growth. But no amount of natural beauty could dispel the shadow that had fallen over Marguerite and her home. The entire parish had essentially shunned her. When Celeste went to town for supplies, shopkeepers served her quickly and without conversation, eager to have her gone. The priest no longer made his weekly visits. Even the plantation workers, who depended on the Beaumont estate for their livelihoods, performed their duties with nervous efficiency, spending as little time as possible near the main house. Marguerite seemed completely unaffected by her isolation. If anything, she appeared more serene than ever, moving through her days with a calm purposefulness that some found unsettling. She began spending more time in the plantation's extensive gardens, tending to the roses and camellias that had been neglected since Jean-Baptiste's death. She would work for hours in the humid heat, her black dress gradually accumulating dust and pollen, her pale hands becoming stained with soil. Celeste watched from the kitchen windows, marveling at how her mistress seemed almost content for the first time in years. There was something peaceful about the way Marguerite moved among the flowers, something that suggested she had finally found a place where she belonged. In April, an unexpected visitor arrived at the plantation. His name was Thomas Garrett, and he was a journalist from Boston who had heard about the mysterious deaths and the silent woman of Louisiana. He came ostensibly to write a story about Southern Gothic mysteries for his newspaper, but his real interest was in Marguerite herself. Unlike the local residents who had already judged and condemned her, Garrett approached the situation with curiosity rather than fear. He had covered numerous criminal cases during his career, and he had developed an instinct for separating genuine evil from misunderstood tragedy. Something about Marguerite's story intrigued him in a way that went beyond professional interest. Garrett rented a room at the boarding house in town and spent his first week interviewing everyone who had any connection to the case. He spoke with Dr. LeBlanc, who reluctantly shared his observations while insisting he had done nothing wrong. He interviewed Dr. Thornton, who provided detailed scientific explanations that ultimately led nowhere. He sat with Sheriff Rousseau for hours, listening to the lawman's frustrations about a case he knew he would never solve. He even managed to gain Celeste's trust, and the elderly housekeeper told him things she had never shared with the authorities. She described Marguerite's marriage to Jean-Baptiste, how the man had grown increasingly cruel over the years, how he would criticize his wife publicly and belittle her intelligence. She spoke about Claude, who had been kinder, but had made it clear he intended to take control of the plantation and relegate Marguerite to a minor role. And she mentioned Henri Deschamps, who had arrived with papers that would have forced Marguerite to sell the plantation at a fraction of its value. Armed with this information, Garrett finally approached the plantation itself. He arrived on a bright May morning when the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the sounds of birdsong. Marguerite was in the garden when he walked up the drive, her black dress a stark contrast to the riot of colors surrounding her. She looked up at his approach but didn't move, didn't run, didn't show any sign of alarm. Garrett introduced himself, explaining his purpose clearly and honestly. He told her he wasn't there to judge or condemn, but to understand. He said he believed there was more to her story than anyone knew, and he wanted to give her the opportunity to share her truth. Marguerite listened to his entire speech, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then she did something completely unexpected. She smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed her entire face. And then she turned and walked toward the house, glancing back once to indicate he should follow. Garrett followed her into the parlor, where she gestured for him to sit. She didn't offer refreshments, didn't make small talk. Instead, she simply sat across from him and waited. Garrett pulled out his notebook and began asking questions, the same questions everyone had asked before. What happened to your husband? How did Claude die? What did you serve Henri Deschamps for lunch? Marguerite's responses were the same as always, silence and stillness. But Garrett was patient. He had interviewed enough reluctant witnesses to know that sometimes the key to getting someone to talk was simply being present, being willing to wait. So he sat with her, day after day, asking his questions and receiving no answers, but never giving up. He would arrive each morning and sit in that parlor for hours, sometimes reading aloud from newspapers or books, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence. Celeste brought them tea and small cakes, watching this strange ritual with bewilderment. She had never seen anyone treat her mistress with such ordinary kindness, without fear or judgment, and she noticed something else too. Marguerite seemed different when Garrett was there, less like a statue and more like a living woman. There was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before, Her hands moved more naturally, less rigidly controlled. Once Celeste even heard something that sounded almost like a laugh coming from the parlor, though when she peeked in, both Marguerite and Garrett were sitting quietly, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. As spring turned to summer, Garrett's visits to the Beaumont plantation became a daily occurrence, and the townspeople began to talk about this new development with as much fervor as they had discussed the deaths. Some thought the journalist was a fool, risking his life by spending time alone with a murderer. Others suggested he was in league with her somehow, perhaps even helping her plan her next crime. A few romantic souls whispered that he was falling in love with the silent woman, and she with him, creating a scandal that would surpass even the mysterious deaths. But Garrett paid no attention to the gossip. He was focused entirely on his mission to understand Marguerite Beaumont, and slowly, incrementally, he began to make progress. It started with small gestures. One morning in June, when Garrett arrived at the plantation, he found Marguerite waiting for him on the front porch with a glass of cool lemonade. She handed it to him without a word, but the gesture itself was significant. She was acknowledging his presence, showing hospitality, treating him like a welcome guest rather than an intruder. A few days later, she led him on a tour of the plantation grounds, pointing out various features with sweeping hand gestures. The old oak tree where Jean-Baptiste had proposed marriage, the creek where she had played as a child during visits to her aunt who previously owned the property, the small chapel her husband had promised to build, but never did. Each location told a piece of her story without a single word being spoken. Garrett began to understand that Marguerite's silence wasn't a refusal to communicate. It was simply a different form of communication. She expressed herself through actions, through the things she showed him, through the way she moved through space. He started paying attention to everything, noting which rooms in the house she avoided, which ones she spent the most time in. He observed that she never entered Jean-Baptiste's study, that she walked quickly past Claude's bedroom door, that she sometimes stood in the dining room doorway, staring at the chair where Henri Deschamps had sat during his final meal. Each of these observations added another piece to the puzzle, building a picture of a woman who had been trapped in circumstances beyond her control. One particularly hot afternoon in July, Garrett made a breakthrough. He and Marguerite were sitting in the garden under the shade of a sprawling live oak, the air heavy with humidity and the drone of cicadas. Garrett had been reading aloud from a book of poetry, something he had started doing when the silence grew too heavy. He reached a poem about a caged bird that sang despite its captivity, and when he finished reading, he looked up to find tears streaming down Marguerite's face. She wasn't making a sound, wasn't sobbing or gasping, but the tears flowed freely, cutting tracks through the light powder on her cheeks. Garrett set down his book and waited, knowing instinctively that this was a moment of significance. Marguerite reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small leather-bound journal. She held it for a long moment, her fingers trembling slightly, then extended it toward Garrett. He took it carefully, reverently, understanding that she was entrusting him with something precious. The journal was old and well-worn, its pages filled with elegant handwriting. As Garrett began to read, he realized he was looking at Marguerite's voice, the words she had been unable or unwilling to speak aloud. The entries dated back 12 years, to the first months of her marriage to Jean-Baptiste Beaumont. They told a story of gradual suffocation, of a vibrant young woman being systematically broken down by a controlling, abusive husband. The early entries were relatively hopeful, describing her efforts to be a good wife, to manage the household efficiently, to please her demanding husband. But as time went on, the tone changed. Jean-Baptiste criticized everything she did. He mocked her opinions in front of guests. He controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to whom she could speak with. He accused her of being stupid, worthless, incapable of independent thought. And worst of all, he threatened her constantly. If she displeased him, he would send her back to her family in disgrace. If she embarrassed him, he would ensure no one in society would ever receive her. If she ever tried to leave him, he would destroy her reputation so thoroughly that she would have nowhere to go. The journal entries became shorter and more fragmented as the years passed, as if Marguerite was losing the ability to express herself even in writing. But one entry, dated 3 years before Jean-Baptiste's death, stood out. In it, Marguerite described a particularly brutal argument during which her husband had grabbed her by the throat and squeezed until she nearly lost consciousness. When he finally released her, he told her that if she ever spoke against him, if she ever told anyone about their private life, he would kill her. And to prove he was serious, he made her stand in front of a mirror while he held a knife to her throat, forcing her to watch her own potential death. From that day forward, according to the journal, Marguerite had stopped speaking. Not because she couldn't, but because every word felt dangerous. Every sound felt like it might trigger another violent episode. Garrett read the entire journal in one sitting, his hands shaking by the time he reached the final entry. It was dated the morning of Jean-Baptiste's death, and it contained only 5 words written in a shaky hand that suggested extreme emotion. "Today I planted the garden." Garrett looked up at Marguerite, who was watching him with those penetrating dark eyes, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The garden. She had been working in the garden that morning, and Louisiana gardens in August were full of beautiful, deadly plants: oleander, foxglove, belladonna, castor beans, angel's trumpet, all of them capable of causing the exact symptoms that had killed 3 men. The revelation hit Garrett like a physical blow, but it wasn't horror he felt. It was a strange mixture of understanding and sorrow. Marguerite had not been a cold-blooded murderer stalking innocent victims. She had been a desperate woman who had finally found a way to free herself from unbearable circumstances. The garden she had planted 3 years ago had been her escape plan, cultivated with the same care and patience she had applied to surviving her marriage. She had learned about poisonous plants, studied their properties, understood exactly which ones would kill quietly and leave few traces. And when Jean-Baptiste had finally pushed her too far, she had used that knowledge. But Garrett still had questions. He could understand why she had poisoned her husband, even sympathize with it given the abuse she had endured. But what about Claude and Henri? Claude had been kind to her, according to Celeste, and Henri had simply been doing business. Marguerite seemed to read these questions in his expression because she took the journal back and turned to entries Garrett had skimmed over too quickly. There, in painful detail, she had documented everything. Claude had not been as kind as he appeared. In private, he had made it clear that he considered Marguerite his property now, inherited along with the plantation. He had cornered her multiple times, making inappropriate advances that stopped just short of assault. He had told her that she should be grateful for his protection, that a widow alone would be vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. The implication was clear: refuse him and face consequences. As for Henri Deschamps, his crime had been greed and betrayal. The business papers he had brought with him were designed to cheat Marguerite out of her inheritance. He and Jean-Baptiste had made agreements years ago that gave Deschamps certain rights to the plantation upon Jean-Baptiste's death. Rights that would have left Marguerite essentially penniless and homeless. When Marguerite had discovered these documents among her husband's papers after his death, she had understood that even in death, Jean-Baptiste was trying to control and punish her. So when Deschamps had arrived to enforce those agreements, she had seen him not as an innocent businessman, but as an extension of her dead husband's cruelty. The journal entries about that day were particularly chilling in their calm rationality. She had known exactly what she was doing, had planned it carefully, had accepted the consequences. Garrett sat in the garden with the journal in his hands, trying to process everything he had learned. By any legal standard, Marguerite Beaumont was a multiple murderer who deserved to hang. But by any moral standard, she was a victim who had fought back against her oppressors, using the only weapons available to her. The law saw only the dead bodies, but Garrett saw the years of systematic abuse that had led to those deaths. He saw a woman who had been slowly murdered herself, her spirit and voice strangled out of her until she had no choice but to strike back. And he understood now why she had remained silent afterward. Speaking would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant reliving every terrible moment of her marriage. Her silence was both protection and memorial, a way of honoring the woman she had been before Jean-Baptiste destroyed her. The question now was what Garrett would do with this knowledge. He was a journalist sworn to report the truth. The story of the silent woman and her poisoned garden would be a sensation, guaranteed to sell newspapers across the country. It would make his career, establish his reputation as a fearless investigative reporter, but it would also destroy Marguerite completely. She would be arrested, tried, and almost certainly executed. The abuse she had suffered would be dismissed as irrelevant, a failed excuse for inexcusable crimes. The courts would show no mercy to a woman who had carefully, deliberately killed 3 men, regardless of her reasons for doing so. Garrett had seen enough trials to know that justice and fairness were rarely the same thing. He looked at Marguerite, who sat perfectly still waiting for his decision. She had given him the journal knowing full well what it contained, knowing it was a confession of murder. She had trusted him with the truth, and now she was trusting him to decide her fate. Garrett realized that this was her way of speaking, her way of finally telling her story. She had chosen him as her witness, her confessor, perhaps even her judge. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. He closed the journal carefully and held it out to her. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it back. Their fingers touched briefly, and Garrett felt the coldness of her skin, the trembling he could barely detect. That night, Garrett sat in his room at the boarding house and wrote 2 articles. The first was the story everyone expected, a sensational account of the silent woman of Louisiana, the mysterious deaths, the atmosphere of Gothic horror that surrounded the Beaumont plantation. It was good writing, compelling and dramatic, but it contained no accusations, no revelations, no truth beyond the surface facts. The second article was the real story. Everything he had learned about Marguerite's abuse, her desperate plan, her calculated revenge. It was powerful writing, perhaps the best work he had ever done, but it was also a death sentence for the woman he had come to admire. Garrett stared at both articles for hours, unable to decide which one to send to his editor in Boston. By dawn, he had made his choice. He carefully burned the second article, watching the pages curl and blacken in the fireplace, watching Marguerite's secrets turn to ash. Then he sealed the first article in an envelope and arranged for it to be posted. It would take weeks to reach Boston, and by then, Garrett would be long gone from Louisiana. He had one more thing to do before he left. He returned to the Beaumont plantation one final time, arriving just as the summer sun was beginning to heat the morning air. Marguerite was in the garden, as he knew she would be, tending to her flowers with gentle, practiced movements. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and something passed between them without words. Understanding, gratitude, farewell. Garrett left Louisiana the following day, carrying with him a story he could never tell and memories he would never forget. His article about the silent woman was published in August and was reprinted in newspapers across the country. It captured the public imagination exactly as he had known it would, spawning theories and debates that would continue for years. Some readers believed Marguerite was guilty, others thought she was innocent. Most simply found the mystery deliciously unsettling. But without any new evidence or accusations, the authorities had no reason to reopen their investigation. Sheriff Rousseau read the article with resignation, recognizing that the case would forever remain unsolved. Dr. Thornton filed it away with his other medical mysteries, and life in the parish gradually returned to normal, though the Beaumont plantation retained its dark reputation. Marguerite continued to live in isolation, but as summer turned to fall, something began to change. It started small. The plantation workers noticed that she had started humming while she worked in the garden, soft melodies that drifted across the grounds like whispers. Celeste reported that her mistress had begun eating more, taking pleasure in her meals for the first time in years. The rigid tension that had characterized Marguerite's movements slowly relaxed, and she began to move through the house with something approaching grace. It was as if telling her story, even silently through the journal, had released some of the poison that had been accumulating in her soul. She would never speak again. That habit was too deeply ingrained, but she was no longer completely silent either. She had found other ways to express herself, to be present in the world. In October, a young widow from town named Marie Fontaine came to the plantation asking for work. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her penniless and desperate. Most people would have turned her away, but Marguerite took her in without hesitation. She gave Marie a room in the main house, and taught her to manage the household accounts, to oversee the workers, to handle all the responsibilities that running a large plantation required. Marie was grateful and loyal, never asking questions about the rumors that surrounded her benefactor. She simply worked hard and treated Marguerite with respect and kindness. Over time, other women in difficult circumstances found their way to the Beaumont plantation. A young mother fleeing an abusive husband, an elderly seamstress who could no longer afford her rent in town, a girl who had been thrown out by her family for refusing an unwanted marriage. Marguerite took them all in, creating a household of women who had nowhere else to go. Together they formed an unusual community, working the plantation, maintaining the grounds, supporting one another through hardships. The townspeople whispered about this development too, calling the plantation a haven for troublesome women, a place where natural order had been inverted. But Marguerite didn't care what they said. For the first time in her adult life, she was surrounded by people who didn't try to control her, who didn't demand that she be something she wasn't. The silence that had once been a prison became a choice, a form of communication that her household understood and respected. They learned to read her gestures, her expressions, the ways she moved through space. They created a language of their own, one that didn't require words. The plantation prospered under this unusual arrangement. The cotton crops were more successful than they had been in years. The gardens bloomed with extraordinary abundance. The main house, which had seemed so dark and oppressive, became warm and welcoming. Visitors to the parish sometimes reported seeing lights in the windows at night, hearing laughter drifting across the fields, glimpsing figures dancing on the wide front porch. These reports always featured Marguerite at the center, her black dresses replaced by softer colors, her face often tilted toward the sky, as if listening to music only she could hear. The silent woman had found her voice after all, not in words but in the life she had built from the ruins of her past. Years passed, and the scandal of the 3 deaths faded into local legend. New dramas and tragedies captured the parish's attention. Children grew up hearing stories about the silent woman as cautionary tales, though the lessons varied depending on who was telling them. Some said she was a warning about the dangers of female independence. Others claimed she proved that silence could be more powerful than speech. A few wise souls suggested she was simply a woman who had survived impossible circumstances in the only way she could. Thomas Garrett never returned to Louisiana, but he followed news of the parish from afar, and he occasionally heard reports about Marguerite and her household of women. Each time, he felt a mixture of relief and melancholy, knowing that his decision to protect her secret had been right, but wondering what price she continued to pay for her survival. Marguerite Beaumont lived to be 68 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep on a warm spring morning in 1883. The women of her household buried her in the family cemetery, placing her grave between the 2 oak trees that stood like sentinels at the edge of the property, far from the graves of Jean-Baptiste, Claude, and Henri. They marked her resting place with a simple stone that bore only her name and dates. No epitaph, no explanation. But they planted the grave with every beautiful flower that grew in Louisiana, creating a riot of color that bloomed year after year. Foxglove and roses, oleander and magnolias, angel's trumpet and honeysuckle, a garden of both poison and beauty, just like the woman who lay beneath it. And if anyone noticed the symbolism, they were wise enough not to speak of it aloud. Some secrets, after all, are meant to remain buried, tended carefully by those who understand that silence can be both weapon and sanctuary, both prison and freedom. The silent woman of Louisiana had never spoken a word to defend herself, but in the end, her silence had told a story more powerful than any testimony could have been. It was a story about survival, about the terrible choices that impossible circumstances can force upon us, and about the strange redemption that can be found in creating beauty from ashes. Her garden remained, generation after generation, a living monument to a woman who poisoned no one who didn't deserve it and buried them all, one by one, before finally learning to live again. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity, So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.